Alright, let's have us a little lesson on the urinary system. Let's go through the slide that I've prepared. When we look at the function of the kidneys, if we do an overview first, their main job is to prepare urine so we can get rid of water and metabolic wastes and keep our body clean. The kidneys eliminate metabolic products and also toxic substances. So when we look at the metabolic products, for example, that can be is protein breakdown, urea, uric acid, stuff like that. And toxic substances are like medication. A lot of medication are being excreted by the kidneys, so we want to be careful of how much medication we take in because it will reflect on the kidney function, makes it harder over time for the kidney to work. And so the more medication we eat, the faster the kidneys will break down. We also maintain electrolytes concentration, acid-base balance, osmotic pressure, as well as osmotic pressure of bodily fluids. That's a lot, but that has to do a lot with salt, with ions concentration, and we'll go more into that as we move forward. We also regulate blood pressure, and we control the blood-forming elements through hormones. So what we do in the kidneys, we secrete hormones like renin and erythropoietin that stimulates the blood-forming elements, the red blood cells, for example. Erythropoietin is the hormone that stimulates the red blood cell production. So let's come look at the anatomy. When we look at the kidneys, we have a kidney bean-shaped structure which lies retroperitoneal. That means it's outside of the serous membrane system that protects the organs of the abdomen, the peritoneal membranes. And we have two of them. We have one on either side of the lumbar spine. And medially, we have the area where the vessels come in and out. You can see that here in the radiograph on the X-ray. Here are the kidney outlines. This is the lumbar spine. And here we have the vessels coming in and out. That's the medial side in here. And that's called the hilus. And that's where it's like in the lungs, basically. It's the same thing. It's also called the hilus in the lungs. And on top of the kidneys, if here's the kidneys drawn, we can't see it on the X-ray there, but on top we have the adrenal gland sitting there. And so it's like a cap there. And then surrounding each kidney, because we are retroperitoneally and are more exposed to shaking and so forth, and events coming from the outside in, we have a fatty capsule around it, and that is enclosed then with renal fascia. So we have fat here, and we have renal fascia around it that holds everything together. And this helps the kidney move somewhat while they are well protected. And when we starve, the problem becomes that the fat in the kidneys that surrounds the kidneys is going to be utilized for energy, and that increases the kidney's mobility, and that makes them more vulnerable to damage. Alright, let's look at an overview of the function of the kidney. So what happens is blood passes by the kidneys. It's about 20% of the cardiac output. So that's quite a bit of blood. That amounts to about 1,700 liters or 1,700 quarts per day. Blood plasma with dissolved substances. So blood plasma and dissolved substances in it is filtered through the kidneys into a long tubular system of a nephron. And so a nephron is that tubular system is called a nephron as a whole. And when we look at what goes into there is dissolved substances in the plasma except for larger proteins. So most everything except for larger proteins, of course, and cells is filtered through that kidney as the blood passes by it. And that accounts to then about 170 liters a day. And that becomes the filtrate. And then as the filtrate moves from the beginning stages where it's filtered, which is right here in this weird looking thing, or right here, it's a better picture to see where the blood comes into this capsule shaped structure, and it is filtered through there. There's a filter in there, which we'll look at that in a little bit. And after that, it moves through all these tubes in here, and the red and blue are the blood vessels that hang around there, and in doing that process it will be concentrated into urine and drains then from here into the bladder, and there we are voiding it and we avoid about 1.5 liters a day if we are well enough hydrated. And so that's quite of a concentration pathway there. Each of the functional units in a kidney start with a renal capsule, and that's that area right here. And the renal capsule is a tuft of capillaries, which we can also call the glomerulus. That's this right here, these capillaries that are in here. And then it's surrounded by a double-walled cup, and that's this wider looking structure. That's a double-walled cup that is called the Bowman's capsule. And that is actually the proximal end of the renal tubular system. And so we got in each kidney about 1.2 million of those structures. And so all together, they help then filter 170 liters a day and we void about 1.5 liters of that. Ooh, that was a loud one. The glomerular filtrate then, after it leaves the Bowman's capsules, flows through various tubular segments, as most substances and about 99% of the water will be reabsorbed back into the blood. And when we look at the substances, what goes back into the blood system, we want to look at the glucose, of course, that's food. Amino acids, great, we're going to make proteins with that. Ions, excellent, we need that. So all the stuff that's useful will be brought back into the blood. The rest we leave in the filtrate so we can pee it out. And then, of course, 99% of the water will be going back in. That's why the concentration is so great. And that area where the water is actually reabsorbed back into the blood, a lot of it is known as the vasa recta. That's the blood vessel area that, if you look at here, this is the Bowman's capsule, this is the glomerular structure, and the blood comes from here, from the renal artery here in and feeds into this glomerulus, and then it leaves. And then it hangs around this tubular structure. And this hanging around part of the tubular structure, that is known as the vasa recta. We have some different pictures coming up. And so as the filtrate goes through the tubes, most substances get reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. But what also happens simultaneously, some substances like hydrogen ions that are toxic to us, or uric acid, or some drugs, they are actively secreted from the blood into the tubular system after we've filtered it already. So they're going to come from the blood into the tubular system, and that's known as secretion in this process situation here. So when we talk about the kidneys, we use the term filtration as the first part, what happens here, the red arrow. And then reabsorption is what happens from going to filtrate, going back to the blood. And then secretion is the purple one, and that's where we take substances such as the hydrogen ions and so forth, and drugs, and excrete them from the blood and put them actively into the filtrate that we can pee them out and get rid of them that way. And so once we've done all these processes, we have a collecting duct that concentrates the urine in a channel in here. That's the collecting duct in here. And this is where we have another area where we can concentrate the urine further and then channel it into a collection of all these collecting ducts. So they get funneled together into what ends up being a renal pelvis, which then is voided via the ureter into the urinary bladder. And then we exit, or the urine exits through the urethra. When we look now at the kidney a little bit more in detail, going from the outside in, we have first the renal capsule. And then underneath that renal capsule that holds the kidney together, we have the cortex. And the cortex is this structure that's wider here, that's lighter colored, that goes around. And the cortex is composed, when we take a slice of that right in here, we take a slice of that, and so that wider structure is the cortex. The cortex is composed of the Bowman's capsule, the glomerulus, and then the first part of this wiggly line here, and that part is going to be called the proximal convoluted tubule, like here, proximal convoluted tubule. And then what happens is then the tube goes deep into the inner structure, and the inner structure is known as the medulla. So the outer is the cortex, the inner is the medulla. And the tube that goes down deep into the medulla is known as the loop of Henle. That's the part of that tube. That segment is called the loop of Henle. And we have an ascending and a descending segment of those. And then we get back out towards the cortex, and then we have another wiggly line coming off of there, and that segment is then known as the distal convoluted tubule. Convoluted means, wiggly. And from there, then we're gonna go into the collecting duct and reach into what becomes first our renal papillae, and then it will become a renal pelvis, and then we get to the ureter and exit through the bladder. We look at, so we have the cortex, we have the medulla. We talked a little bit about these tubules, and let me go back to this here, because the pyramids are seen here. These structures that reach up like that, they're three-dimensional in reality, and so they look like a pyramid. They look like they're pointing down a little bit. Pyramids. They're pointing down, and then as they go back up, they get wider. It doesn't look like that in this picture. Maybe this up here looks a little bit more like it. There you go. We can look at the model in class. Okay, we have 10 or 12 of those, and they're formed within the renal medulla, and they have the apices, so they're formed pointing down, and their apices reach into funnel kind of structures that then collect all the urine, and the funnels are called the renal papillae, right here, and or the openings of the funnels, because the funnels themselves then are actually known as the renal calyces. We have minor ones and we have major ones. It's just the smaller ones are the minor ones, and they feed into bigger ones, they collect them together, and we finally get into the renal pelvis. And that's the big funnel, so to speak, that feeds into the ureter. And then we get to the bladder, and the ureter is how we leave or void the urine. The blood vessels is an important part of the situation. The renal blood vessels, we have two renal arteries that come from the aorta and bring blood into each of the kidneys. The blood goes through the hilus into the kidneys. And from there, we get smaller and smaller, and we have offshoots coming up. So the first one we have is the interlobar arteries that come up. They go right here, interlobar arteries. You see them right here, and they give rise to the arcuate arteries. So the inner lobar go between the lobes, between the pyramids, and then the arcuate arteries reach around. Arcuate means arch. They reach around the top of the pyramid, and they and are in between the cortex and the medulla. And then we have interlobular arteries, so not interlobar, now they're interlobular, and they enter the cortex from where we get the afferent arterioles coming off. So the renal artery comes in, the interlobar vessels go in between the pyramids, the arcuate artery reach over the pyramids, and then the interlobular arteries come off of that, reaching into the cortex, feeding into the afferent arterioles. And that then becomes the capillary tuft, the glomerulus, inside the Bowman's capsule, and that's how we filter the blood. And the veins are essentially the same thing backwards. We're not going to worry about naming those right now. Most of that is the